Hello and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. Oil is one of the most important commodities in modern life, and the world oil market supplies us with this good. The oil market is truly a global market, and it has been for over 100 years. And yet many people view this market with suspicion, subject to manipulation, and use of as an instrument of foreign policy. Economists have naturally studied the market for many years as well. And although there are some disagreements, what we often find is that the market works pretty well to bring together persons from across the globe to generate a truly remarkably steady supply of this vital commodity. Joining me to talk about the economics of oil today is my colleague from the Johnson Center, Dr. Philip Mixon. Welcome back to the show, Philip.
Thank you.
You've done some research on the oil market yourself, right? Your dissertation and several papers that you've published.
That is correct.
Now, I mentioned that economists, when we look at the oil market, basically end up seeing a lot of evidence of supply and demand. But before we get into the specifics of why we might see that, when economists use this frame, like, oh, it's supply and demand, which in some ways is the answer to everything, every question, what exactly do we mean?
We mean that you have producers producing a good, you have consumers or businesses or other entities wanting the good. People that produce it value their good that they've produced. People that want it or value the good, want to consume the good. They interact, they determine how much they value it, whether they want to exchange, whether they want to actually, I would say, contract business. Mm-hmm. And supply and demand is just economist way of describing that situation.
And out of the supply and demand in markets, we'll end up with a price being set. And so, one of the first things people like to look at is the price of oil. And this is a long-term graph of the price of oil to show, well, we've certainly had some ups and downs in the oil market, right?
Right. Well, if you look, from 1970 back, we had pretty stable prices. Then you get the oil crisis of the 70s. Then we get back to, once we get over that, 80s and 90s, we pretty much have flat prices again, and we've started to go back up. Now, I would say, if you notice, 2003 to 2006, you started seeing a rise. That's also when you start seeing a rise of the automobile in other countries. For example, China. China has had a large recent development of use of the automobile, where it was motorcycles and motorbikes and bicycles.
And so that's a part of what we mean by forces of supply and demand. When more people in China own cars and want to drive those cars, they're contributing to demand now.
Right, that's correct.
And you see that little spike down there in 1997, 98. That was, I think, the East Asian financial crisis, right?
Right, and you had a lot of, I think Japan is, besides the United States, Japan is the number one. If it wasn't for the United States, Japan per capita would use more gas than anyone else. And you had the Asian financial crisis. Japan has a financial crisis. Fewer people are buying cars, fewer people are driving cars. Mm-hmm. You get dip in the price of oil.
And so when we say that we see evidence of supply and demand, we're looking at these supply and demand factors that can help make sense of why this price is going up and down.
Right. If you look at this graph and you look at dates on this graph, each one of these dates on the graph correspond with some kind of either supply or demand shock in the market. Mm-hmm. You look at 2008, sorry.
So let's jump ahead here. Yeah. 2008, we saw a peak in the price of oil.
Right. Then you have an immediate drop when you had the financial crisis late 2008. Right. Less people driving cars, less people taking vacations, less people driving. Price of oil goes down.
Over the last year and a half or so, the signal event in the world oil markets have been the decline in the price. Right. But again, we can see evidence of supply and demand in this as well, right?
Right. Well, you have supply in that we've basically now have a oil boom in the United States with North Dakota, Texas, a little bit in Pennsylvania, new reserves, I guess, not really the best way of saying it, but new reserves have been found and new innovative ways to get to these reserves so that we can have more oil. Basically, supply has increased. Mm-hmm.
And I think over the last year or so, we've also seen some economic downturns in Europe and Asia that might have affected the demand side as well, right?
Right. You have Europe is still drudging its way out of the 2008 recession. And less people wanting to buy cars, less people wanting to drive, more people reliant on public transportation, which in Europe is more electrified than it is here.
Now, we like to talk about the oil industry as if like gasoline, your local gas station is like the industry, but it's really a very complicated process to get gasoline to our local gas station, right?
It is. It is not simply pump it out of the ground, refine it a little bit, get it, and go pump it into your car. It's a very complex. You're dealing with national governments, you're dealing with maritime laws, you're dealing with all kinds of other situations. It's not just simply an oil well sitting in your backyard pumping out oil. That oil has to be transported from the oil well to a refinery. From the refinery, it has to be refined into whatever product you want to use. Then you have to get it from the refinery to the end product. And there's several wholesalers and industry jargons called jobbers that take it from the refinery to the gas station.
And it's not just gasoline that we're getting out when we're refining oil, we're getting other products as well.
It is amazing the sheer number of consumer products that come out of oil. I challenge you to just do a Google search on products that come from oil. I have a 12-page list here I printed out just as an example. It is immense how much oil we actually consume.
And that factors in as well, because if you want gasoline to power our cars, then we also have to compete in effect for that oil against, say, using it to make it jet fuel or heating oil or other products, right?
That's correct. And I would say another, I guess, interesting fact is oil refineries are probably some of the most efficient processes that we have. Every single thing that they can squeeze out of oil, they do, because it's so valuable. Asphalt, for example, is a byproduct of refining gasoline. But we found a use for it because it's still valuable.
So after they refine the oil, they've got some stuff left over, and if they can do something with it, they
will definitely use it. I mean, think of propane. Propane used to be just burned off as waste product. Now it is used to heat homes, barbecue. It is a very efficient market. Not much of oil is used as waste or is expelled as waste.
Goes to waste out.
Right.
And it's also a process that is quite involved. I mean, it takes a long time to build an oil field, right? When you think about building one of these refineries or even like a oil tanker, pipelines that we use to ship oil around and so forth, all of this takes a long time, right?
Right. If you look at the start to actual production of a oil well, to actually getting oil out of the ground, you're looking at least 8 to 10 years. First, you have to have a GIS, geological survey of an area to see if there's any possibility of oil. Then you have to start negotiating with all the landowners, the local government, the national government, the state government, local government, to get all of your permissions to start looking for the oil. Then you start actually getting a group of roughneckers on there to drill the hole. Then you have to find if there's oil in it. Then if you find oil, then you have to, is it a viable oil well? Just because there's oil there doesn't mean it's a viable oil well. There might only be enough there might be oil there, but not enough to actually justify commercial production. Okay? Then, once you actually determine it's worth producing, then you have a short 8 to 10 year lifespan on that oil well. So it does not simply drill a hole, put a pump, done. And during that 8 to 10 year lifespan, oil prices can go up, oil prices can go down. You can have, oil companies do lose money. When oil prices go down, they don't want to be pumping oil. But they have to be to keep there's a lot of complex legal rules with pumping oil. If you shut off a pump, does it actually affect whether or not you can turn the pump back on? So.
And so although when oil prices happen to be high, you can make record profits, but there'll be other years over which that you have that oil field in production and prices won't be so high.
Right.
You might be losing money.
For example, this past year, when you had the Arabs not being, or Saudi Arabia and OPEC not happy with the oil boom going on in the United States, they they expanded the production to get the price lower. They can absorb a loss longer than the, I guess, oil companies in the United States can. So they're trying to, I don't want to say manipulate the market, but they're trying to get the market in their favor.
And when you're talking about the span of 10 or 20 years from the time you start into exploration and preparation till the time you're going to pump the last oil out, I mean, lots of things could happen just technologically or regulatory wise as well. I mean, you could always develop new technologies that would reduce the amount of oil we end up using as a society, right?
Right. For example, it's either Honda or Toyota is seeing their entire fleet wants their entire fleet to go to hydrogen. Well, if that happens, there's no, if it's Toyota, the largest car maker in the world, they actually can dictate market terms to go to hydrogen instead of gasoline.
So there's a lot of risk involved in this.
Yeah, it's
market.
not simply put a pipe in the ground and cash in and you're rich for the rest of your life.
We've already mentioned the term OPEC, and that's another element in which the oil market's a little different than some traditional markets. OPEC serves serves as a cartel, but before we get into exactly what OPEC is, or what OPEC does in the market, let's talk a little bit like what exactly is OPEC for let's remind our viewers what OPEC is, and then let's talk about what a cartel is trying to do.
Okay. OPEC stands for Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. And it is basically a group of countries that have come together that all, by definition, export petroleum. And they come together to try and control the supply side of the market. Not off the top of my head can I remember how much of the oil they actually control, but it's a significant percentage, and that they can, I don't want to say dictate, but they can at least help the market determine what the proper supply of oil is.
And I think even more important than their current production is they have an even larger share of the world's oil reserves.
Right. Of the largest proven oil reserves, difference between oil reserves and proven oil reserves. Proven oil reserves are oil reserves we know we can get. To say that we have oil here is fine. Proven oil reserves is we can get it out of the ground. OPEC controls a significant portion. You're talking Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, Nigeria, Malaysia, Iran, some of the largest proven oil reserves in the world.
And what they're trying to do is restrict the amount of oil that gets onto the world market, right?
That is correct.
And they're able to do that in part because of some actions that those governments took before the 1970s, right? They
Right.
nationalized oil production.
Right. All of the countries in OPEC have nationalized oil industries. That's not to say that the national government controls all of the oil coming out, but they control, or at least own the rights to the oil. For example, I know Chevron, Royal Dutch Shell, BP have rights in a lot of these countries, but the government controls how much BP or Chevron or ExxonMobil can take out of the ground.
And that's important. And if the government of Saudi Arabia says we're going to cut back our oil production, they can actually mean it because
Yes.
they control ultimately the oil.
Yeah, if the king of Saudi Arabia says we are going to cut back oil production, they cut back oil production.
And in the 1970s, certainly OPEC flexed its muscles and were able to reduce the amount of oil that was coming onto the world markets, right?
That is correct. If I'm a little bit younger than my compadre here, my parents experienced the 2-mile-long lines for 10 gallons of gas during the 1970s. Yeah. There were price controls put in place. Not to give you a history lesson, the Saudi Arabia and the Arab countries did not like some of the policies of the United States and decided they were going to stop sending oil to the United States. Well, to stop the price of oil or stop the price of gasoline and oil products going up, it started with the Nixon administration, continuing the Ford administration, and then the Carter administration instituted price controls. And the price controls are, we are not going to pay more than X amount for gasoline. Mm-hmm. And you get lines like this and signs like that. Now, a kind of modern day version of this is when a hurricane hits. Right. You see the same type of situation. We control the price after the storm, and we get no gas. You get signs, sorry, no gas, or 10 gallons ration only. Mm-hmm.
So, although, as when I was young and remembering the oil crisis in the 70s, it was popularly blamed on OPEC and the Middle Eastern countries, but it was really as much a product of our price controls we had on.
I'm sorry. I would say it's more a result of the price controls than it is the embargo. Mm-hmm. For example, today, if you look at today, the number one source of United States oil is actually Canada. Mm-hmm. So that even if the Saudi Arabia was to put embargo on the United States, most of our oil still comes from other places.
Well, a few years ago, about 10 years ago or so, there was a lot of a number of books being written, a lot being said in the press about sort of the end of oil, or peak, as the phrase is repeated, peak oil. What did that refer to?
All right, first off, there's a difference between peak oil and running out of oil. Peak oil was, we are going to get to a maximum production of oil. Mm-hmm. We are going to get to a maximum per day barrel of oil production. And if running out of oil is, there's no more. Peak oil was supposed to have happened in 2003 or 2002. And I would say Herbert has the same problem as Thomas Malthus did. He didn't think about the ingenuity of humans. Mm-hmm. And we found better, faster, more efficient ways of getting oil out of the ground. And new ways to get oil out of the ground, so that we've had a peak, went down, and we're climbing back mm-hmm. up again.
And certainly since 2008, I mean, the big change has been actually a big surge in oil production in the United States. Now, right. We've talked about oil reserves, and you've used this term proved oil reserves before, but I think it's worth mentioning because, in addition to the peak oil hypothesis, people have often looked at the amount of reserves that we have in the world and suggested, we only have 10 years or 15 or 20 years of oil left. If you take reserves divided by our annual usage of oil across the globe, you get a number here that systematically looks at we're only about 10 or 15 or 20 years away from running out of oil. These are proved oil reserves since 1980, and the important thing, regardless of what the numbers are, is that this number is going up, and that might strike a lot of our viewers as sort of bizarre, maybe impossible, because if you remember from our geology, the oil was done by natural science processes that's been in the ground for a long time. So how can we be finding more oil when the oil's been there for thousands of years?
It's again goes back to, we have found new and better ways of getting oil out of the ground. Mm-hmm. Oil that was, when I was talking about just drilling a hole and there's oil there, but it might not be enough for viable production. Well, now we can make that viable for production. Mm-hmm. We have new technologies, new instead of having to go straight down, now we can drill at different angles. We can drill at we can drill down a mile, turn, go a mile that way, and then go down another mile to get to oil that before we couldn't, because if we'd have drilled into it, we'd have just got water. Or we'd have just got some other non-usable item.
The other thing that's been going on is the development of what is known as hydraulic fracturing that's allowed in places like North Dakota to start to exploit shale oil.
Right.
So what's up? What's this hydraulic fracturing? Because it's been very controversial.
Basically, I'm not an expert on it, but I'm not an engineer. That's my brother-in-law. We have a rock that has oil in it, or crude in it. We can't get to it just by drilling. So what we do is we drill to it, and then we blast water into it, and some other chemicals. I'm not sure the chemicals, but they blast mainly water and sand. The chemicals are actually to bind the sand together. Blast water and sand in it, and it actually explodes the rock. And then you can take all the oil that was in that rock out of that rock. That's a crude. That's a lot more complex than that, but sorry.
And that's led to this boom in U.S. oil production, which has been, probably most significant, most visible in western North Dakota of all places, right?
Right. You have basically boom towns being created in North Dakota all over the place. If you look at the map, literally the entire western half or western quarter of North Dakota now looks like basically the creation of suburbs after the 1950s. Just houses exploding everywhere. It's a little off color, but it's funny anecdotes of prostitutes leaving Las Vegas to go to North Dakota because that's where all the money is. So it has went from, I have driven through here. There's nothing there, and now you have towns, you have casinos, you have all kinds of things just to capitalize on the oil boom.
And it does show, the first graph there shows like what's happened to the production. The production has just gone
through the roof. It's went from literally not commercially viable to the source of an oil boom.
In some ways, it wasn't a complete surprise at all, because I remember reading for years before this, they were saying that if the price of oil ever got to $80 or $100 a barrel, it would become feasible or profitable to be able to start to exploit this oil there.
And once it got to about $100 a barrel, it became not only feasible, but let's get it out of the ground.
Now, the United States currently has a restriction or a ban on exports of our oil, which I think goes back. I think it was a restriction that was imposed back in the 70s during during the oil shock, and at the time, it might have seemed like a reasonable thing to do because we were seemingly so short on oil. We're having to import oil, the supplies of oil being reduced by OPEC and others, that we didn't, politicians wanted to step in and say, well, if we have a limited amount of oil, our oil supply is scarce here or questionable, maybe we need to make sure we don't export any of our own oil. But from an economic standpoint, that's always been sort of a questionable or a poor policy. And a part of the reason it's a poor policy has to do with the fact that when we talk about oil, there's actually a lot of different kinds of oil, right?
To say you have crude oil is, you can always tell someone who's never worked or been around the oil industry if you say just crude oil. Crude oil is a generic term for about 250 different items. There are just in the United States, there's at least 5 different crude oils you can get. You have West Texas sweet crude, West Texas intermediate crude, shale crude from North Dakota. You have Alaskan crude. You have Cushing sweet crude. All these. Basically, we have every every crude has a location indicator. For example, Saudi Arabia sweet crude has a location, and then it has a designation of sweet meaning low sulfur, low older metals, then light or heavy. Light crude it flows easily. Basically, it's very liquid. Heavy crude is very thick. The difference in refining is light crude is more like a simple sugar, table sugar, if you will. Very easy to get into, has a pretty good amount of energy in it, but that's it. A heavy crude is more like a hearty bread. It's hard to get into, a lot of complex sugars. Body takes a long time to break down, but there's a lot of energy in it. Heavy crude leads itself to more, say, production than, say, light crude.
And this is important because when you have oil refineries and so forth, and they're going to be tailored or specialized to use certain types of oil and not others, right? You can't easily switch from one type of oil to another going into a refinery or other industrial uses.
Right. If you look at refining, if it is a sweet crude, it is a much easier refining process than, say, a sour crude. Sour crude has a lot of sulfur in it, a lot of other metals that you have to take out. The United States gas has very low sulfur requirements. The United States diesel has very low sulfur requirements. You have to get as much of that sulfur out as possible. If it's a sweet crude, you don't have to do that as much. A heavy crude like Venezuelan oil, which is one of the heaviest crudes, it is a long process to get all of the sulfur out that you have to get out. 5% of Venezuelan oil is sulfur. So you have to get that 5% out.
So it would always have made sense because even though for the years we've been importing a lot more oil than we've been producing ourselves, there would always be the possibility that in certain types of oil we might have a surplus of oil that would make sense to try to export.
Right. I like to, especially in Alabama, go over. Alabama has a large coal vein going to the north part of the state. Most of that coal is exported as metallurgical coal. We send it to China, to Brazil, so they can make steel, or we can make steel. We'll send some of it into the United States. But we import a lot of coal into Alabama for power plants because the metallurgical coal that Drummond produces up north is very high in heavy metals, and we can't use it for power production. So it's not just simply oil is oil is oil. Same way coal is not coal is not coal. Some oil cannot be used for some processes.
Well, and that's an important thing to keep in mind because I think as economists, a lot of times we forget a lot of these details that are out there in the real world because we don't have to deal with them on every day. It's easy to sort of abstract and just think about the oil market when there's dozens of oil.
Yeah, there's lots of different oil markets.
Well, thanks very much, Philip. I think this has been a helpful discussion. I hope you've enjoyed it too. And thank you for joining us. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.
My expensive mics you're trying